Welcome to DAC, Data Analytics Colloquium. It's really, I'm happy, and this is our season finale, and thank you for coming up here today. And before we start, as usual, and now I have to give you a very short and brief introduction to, about DAC. That's why we coined it. Data Analytic Colloquium, which is supported by National Chongqing University College of Law and Politics in Taiwan, and also the University of Texas at Dallas School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences. So we've been working on this project or initiative for 4 years. So this is our fourth season, and then we were so honored to have Dr. Ryan Kennedy as our season finale. No pressure though. So this colloquium, we convenes international scholars and data scientists, especially those methodologists in the political science. So we target all those scholars, and today one of them is that Ryan wrote a very, is a highly cited article in Science. So we can all ask him or them about these matters or about this, some controversial things, because we have been talking about this paper or that study of Google study for many years. So, and the members of the colloquium, they were engaged in conversations. So we welcome all the questions, and either from faculty members or students, but mostly students. So again, I welcome you all, and I think I'm gonna pass my microphone to Dr. Ho, and then to give a short introduction to Dr. Ryan Kennedy. Carl?
All right, great. Thank you, Dr. Pan. Let me introduce myself. My name is Carl Ho. I'm a co-host here at UT Dallas with Dr. Pan at NCXU. I'm really excited tonight, and I have Professor Ryan Kennedy. So this is the name I use a lot in my class, talking about their paper, and particularly when you talk about data science, every data science student must read his paper and on science. But anyways, let me get started with a quick introduction with Dr. Kennedy. And Dr. Kennedy is a professor at the Political Science Department at University of Houston. He carries multiple titles. He currently is a PI, a principal investigator of the NSF-funded project called Community Responsive Algorithm for Social Accountability, CRESA. And he recently he was awarded and the excellent scholar. And now you need to ask him more about his work that for this award, the word of his award, and I will push him to talk more during the Q&A. And he also directs a lab called the Machine Assisted Human Decision Making Lab at UH, and then he's the founding associate director of the Analytics for Intuitive Initiative for Sustainability Energy Policy, and he's an editor of Research and Politics and a research associate at the Hobby Center for Public Policy at University of Houston. And actually, there will be a long list. I do not want to waste too much time, and maybe we can poke him while he's doing his presentation. I also want to use this opportunity to welcome the co-author. His work he's presented today, Ms. Amanda Austin, and Amanda is a PhD student at University of Houston. And I think if you have any questions, I think you can ask both the authors here. Without further ado, I think I should stop talking here. Let me introduce Professor Dr. Ryan Kennedy.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to the introduction. It's kind of like when people applaud at the beginning of a presentation. You're always like, oh boy, I hope I can live up to that. But I really appreciate the invitation to be here today and the ability to talk about some of the recent work that I've been doing with several of my colleagues, as well as a couple of my graduate students, one of whom is Amanda Austin, a very talented graduate student. There's going to be some universities going to be very lucky to have her as a professor here before too much longer. So Let me give you a little bit of background on this. So, oh my gosh, I guess now I hate to admit this. Oh my God. So it's been 2013. So it's been about 10 years ago that I started doing research, utilizing machine learning methods and trying to, apply them to social science questions. And then more recently, what's been happening is we've seen this increase in discussions about the ethics and about trust in artificial intelligence and in machine learning. And I really got interested in this and in whether or not people trusted these systems, whether they overtrust these systems, undertrusted these systems. Part of this, I have to admit, was because of a grant. The Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity was doing a hybrid forecasting competition. And one of the things we had to figure out was whether or not the forecasters we had would actually use the machine-generated forecasts that we were putting before them. And it's kind of spawned off from there. And this project particularly looks at a controversial area of application for artificial intelligence, and that's the use of artificial intelligence to assist in criminal justice matters, including matters such as bail decisions, sentencing, identification of suspects. And what we really wanted to do here was to take a look at whether or not people in the legal community itself trusted these kinds of algorithms, especially relative to other sources of advice that they are likely to get and that they're likely to use in order to make their decisions. So let's begin by talking a little bit about how, so I'm going to use algorithms very generically to refer to artificial intelligence and decision-making systems. We can kind of split hairs on this, but I find this is a pretty good overarching term for use in this. And algorithms are used in a number of different areas to help advise on legal decision-making. They are being used to predict litigation outcomes, and lawyers are currently using this in order to try to figure out whether or not they should bring cases to court. They're used for bail and sentencing decisions to try and determine if somebody should be granted bail while they're awaiting trial, as well as, in certain cases, the length of the sentences that they have if they're convicted. They're used for crime prevention and detection. A number of you are probably familiar with the programs that are utilized in order to determine where crimes are likely to take place, and therefore where different police forces should be allocated in order to try to prevent crimes. They're used in e-discovery. So this is a lot of times when lawyers are presented with the discovery process, they have to comb through just mountains and mountains of papers. And so e-discovery is utilizing artificial intelligence in order to try and figure out which papers are in this huge stack are most relevant to the lawsuit at hand. They are more and more often being used to help write contracts, especially contracts that are relatively standardized. And lastly, they're being used quite a bit for legal research, although I will say the legal research end has been one of the more notorious areas, with everything from Clarence Thomas's use of a AI system in order to try to help get a definition of a traditional definition of some of the words in an important case. Of course, the problem was that the word had a very different meaning prior to 1950. I'm forgetting what the exact word was, but it came up with this like basically nonsensical definition within the context. And then more recently, there was a case where a lawyer turned in a legal brief to a judge that was written using ChatGPT. And as ChatGPT is prone to do, by the way, this is why you should never use ChatGPT to write your papers or your emails or anything like that. It makes stuff up. And so it made up a whole bunch of cases that didn't really exist. He got called out by the judge and became kind of a national laughingstock. But the question which is at hand here is how much trust there is in these algorithms in the legal system. There are two kinds of ideas here and reasons why we worry about this. The first one is that if there's significant distrust of legal tools and processes, this can end up undermining the legitimacy of the courts. So if courts are using these AI algorithms in order to make decisions about bail and sentencing and when to issue a warrant, and they aren't really trusted, then this can end up hurting overall legitimacy of the courts. The second thing is that trust in the tools used in the legal systems influences the strategies used by legal actors. So whether or not people in the legal community trust these systems is going to help determine whether or not they actually use these systems. The way that these are usually utilized is they're used as what are called ADS, or algorithmic decision system, or excuse me, algorithmic decision aids, ADAs. Where they present some kind of advice to a judge or a lawyer, and then the lawyer can either accept or reject that advice. So the amount of trust that they place in this is going to determine whether or not these systems, some of which are reasonably expensive to implement, are actually going to be utilized in the legal system. Now, there's been a lot of previous research on trust in algorithms and trust in AI. A lot of this has been done outside of political science and outside of public policy. Some of the earliest work on this deals with issues of like autopilot in airplanes and whether or not pilots will trust the autopilot system. There are, though, a few studies that have come out in the social sciences. A number of these studies have suggested that, in general, within the public, people are algorithm adverse, especially in issues in what are called the moral domain. So when you're deciding something that might affect another person's life, then the argument is that people tend to disregard the algorithm and trust other sources of advice more. And there are a number of reasons given for this, such as that, algorithms are not viewed as moral actors, and people, greatly value the intent of the actor offering the advice. However, I should say that there are a growing number of studies that people are not actually algorithm averse, that they actually trust algorithms more than human experts in a whole variety of conditions. This includes some of the work that I did with two of my graduate students that came out last year in the Journal of Politics, where what we found was that essentially what we argue is that there's a problem with a lot of these previous studies, namely that a lot of these previous studies were looking at whether or not people trusted an algorithm relative to their own opinion. And as has been shown through decades of research, people tend to overestimate how accurate they are, especially when they don't know a whole lot about the issue. And so instead, we compared it against advice from a judge, advice from a probation officer, advice from these kind of expert sources. And what we found was that people actually tended to give more weight to advice from the algorithm than they did from these sources, with the caveat that they still gave a whole lot of weight to their own initial opinions, right? So people trust themselves, but when it comes to advice from others, they tend to be pretty trusting in algorithms. There's also a little bit of a difference in the way that we analyze this. So a lot of studies of trust of artificial intelligence try to get at this issue simply by asking people, how much do you trust this system? There are different dimensions of trust that people will utilize, right? How much do you trust that this system is going to make the correct decision? How much do you trust that the system is going to align with the goals that you have for the system? How much do you trust that it will behave in an ethical manner, right? So you've got these multiple dimensions of trust that people ask about. We don't take that approach. We look at something called behavioral trust. And the reason for this partially has to do with my own, way of dealing with a lot of algorithms, which is if you ask me how much I trust my GPS, I'm going to tell you I can't trust it any further than I can throw my phone. However, when I'm going somewhere new, the first thing that I do is pull up my GPS and look up how to get there. So I'm going to say that I don't trust the system. I definitely don't think it has any, ethics or is designed to do what necessarily what I want it to, things like that. But I still use it. And so we're going to be looking at that kind of situation. We're looking at behaviorally, how much weight do people give when making a decision to recommendations from computerized system relative to other actors. By the way, I should also just say that in addition to being of interest to the legal community, this is an issue which is of broader interest to quantitative social scientists, right? Because those of you, I'm not sure how many of you in this meeting are as old as I am, but I remember the old quantitative social science wars, right? Where people were arguing that, you know, as we were moving to these more complicated models, that they had less real world impact because, you know, people couldn't understand them, and policymakers, because they didn't understand them, they just disregard them. So there's also a little bit of a question here of, you know, when we run our sometimes complicated models, do policymakers actually trust these things? My own experience suggests that they do, given the amount of interest from policymakers in terms of developing these kinds of tools, but it's something that we need to test. In this particular case, we're surveying particularly members of the legal community. And this differs from our 2022 article where we were looking at people in the general public. The reason why we think there might be some differences in terms of the legal community is that legal professionals have different professional training. They tend to have more education than the general public. And also a lot of them actually have, at this point, experiences with utilizing some of these algorithms for bail decisions, for probation decisions, and things like that. Part of the reason why I found out about these was because my wife was a probation officer, and her job was literally to do the interviews that entered the data into the system to determine what kind of sentence people were likely to get and what the system was going to recommend. So, you know, it's important to understand how practitioners view these tools, as these are the people who will or will not end up using the tools. And also, they're the ones who are going to be presenting it to the general public. If judges regularly rule against the use of algorithms, if they report bad experiences with it, this is going to influence the extent to which the public trusts it through the traditional political science two-step flow. So we drew a sample of 1,019 respondents with experience in the legal field. And we did this between the 14th of October and the 12th of November, 2022, which I am now realizing was almost a full year ago, which reminds me that I've really got to finish up the revisions on this paper and get it out. But we contracted with Surveys USA, who was willing to try and get people in legal professions within our budget. And here are the numbers that we have. So we've got about 30% have some experience in law enforcement, about 30% have experience as paralegals, about 42% have experience as lawyers, and about 3% have experience as judges. Perhaps not surprisingly, it's really tough to get a sample of judges. And we've got about 22% who have other legal jobs. These include things like legal investigators and other jobs that are within the court system. Now, you probably noticed that this adds up to more than 100%. The reason is because I think it was about like 40% of our respondents had more than one position during their legal career. And so we actually end up with a pretty good variety of legal backgrounds here. In terms of demographics, this certainly does not reflect the general population dynamics. This sample is, of course, much more highly educated. Every single one of them has at least a bachelor's degree. Most of them, a large portion of them have some kind of legal degree or post-secondary education, whether that's a master's in criminal justice, et cetera. We have large portion of them that are white, much more than the general population, and a smaller portion that are female than the general population. However, if you look at this and compare it with the demographics in these legal professions, it's not too far off. Especially when you look at, like, for example, lawyers and law enforcement. These are overwhelmingly white male professions. So let's get into the studies. The first study is looking at trust and risk evaluation. And this is perhaps the best known example. Those of you who have done any reading on ethics of AI, you have probably encountered the case of the COMPAS algorithm. COMPAS was an algorithm developed for making bail decisions. It ended up being used as a sentencing algorithm in the state of Wisconsin. And there is a case in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, Loomis versus Wisconsin, which challenged whether or not these were even legal because it included gender as one of the factors. And so the defendant in that case was, well, first off, the judge said that they were making the decision based on the algorithm saying that he was high risk. And then the defendant challenged that, saying that it was gender biased against men from that inclusion. There's additionally a whole lot of other things about COMPAS. ProPublica did a very well-known study about whether or not COMPAS was racially biased. I'm not going to get too much into the nitty-gritty of that, but I'll skip to the ending, which is that this resulted in a number of mathematicians showing that you can't get both fairness in terms of, like, procedure. In other words, making sure that you aren't including race in your model, and at the same time get fairness of outcomes, meaning that the rate of false positives and false negatives are the same for both Black and white defendants. And so this was, a very interesting result that came out of this. Now, the way that we designed this was based on the work, both my 2022 paper as well as the work of Dressel and Farid in 2018 in Science Advances. They basically found that utilizing a very minimal description of the defendant, random people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk could be just as accurate as the COMPAS algorithm, right? And so what we did was we took the exact setup that Dressel and Farid used, gave those people in MTurk, and we filled in these with randomly selected defendant profiles from Broward County, Florida, where we had both the defendant information as well as whether or not they reoffended and their COMPAS scores. We're drawing the same examples as Kennedy et al. 2022, in part so we can have a comparison between what people in the legal community say and what more general public says about these algorithms. Now, I should say when I refer to this as a minimal description, this is one where I talked with my wife about this, who, like I said, used to do this for a living, and she was absolutely horrified that anybody would try to make a decision just based on this information. But as we'll see, people really do trust their ability to make decisions based on this. So what happens, let me go back to this first part. So we present them with this, and we ask them to make a probabilistic forecast, and we give them the Tetlock kind of chart for what different probability levels mean. And we ask them, what's the probability that this person, if they are released, is going to reoffend, is going to commit another felony? Okay? And so they create an initial estimate of how likely the person is to commit a felony. And then we give them some advice. And the advice has several different versions. So one of them is a previous survey of 286 people like yourself. So this is the wisdom of the crowd kind of idea. In theory, when you have a large number of people all making a guess, the average of those guesses should be more accurate than any individual guess would be. The second one is a judge with more than 10 years of experience adjudicating criminal charges of both adults and minors. If you're wondering why we have this extra information about the judge, this was something that a reviewer recommended as we were going through this to make sure that the details on the judge were equivalent to what we had for the algorithm, which is the last one. An algorithm developed by computer scientists and criminal justice researchers based on a statistical analysis of thousands of past defendant records. Now, initially, we had some critics of this who said, well, wait a second, though, you're giving a longer description of the algorithm. To my mind, this is what I would think of as a bare minimum description that's going to be given of an algorithm, right? Like, we don't mention accuracy, we don't mention anything like that. We're just basically giving them an idea of who developed it and what the data was that was used to develop it, right? And we gave them advice from this. The advice was for half of them, it was actually drawn from the COMPAS probability estimates. For the other half of it, it was basically completely random between 10 and 90. We found, as with the previous study that I'd done on this, it really doesn't matter, which is a little bit disturbing, but that's the way that it works. We also remind them of their previous forecast, and we ask them if they want to adjust their forecast. Now, there are two ways that we analyze this. The first way that we analyze this, first off, every person is given 8 different profiles, which means that we probably have heterogeneity both on the basis of profiles. So there are some profiles that are going to be seen as more likely to reoffend than others. For example, people, if they, we're assuming legal professionals know a little bit about criminal justice. So if a defendant is younger, they're probably more likely to reoffend. If they are committing a violent crime, they're probably more likely to reoffend. So we have to deal with heterogeneity by the profile and also by the respondent. Some respondents may be more likely to take the advice than other respondents. So the way that we model this is we model it as a multi-level problem where we have random effects included for both the profile and for the respondent. And the dependent variables that we look at, there are 2 of them. We look at distance to the advice, which is simply the absolute value of the distance from their final forecast to the advice they were given. And the second one is what's called weight of advice. And weight of advice takes into account both the distance from their initial forecast as well as the distance from their final forecast. And the nice thing about weight of advice is it gives us a very nice indicator where 1 means that they fully trusted the advice, so they changed their prediction to exactly match the advice that they received. And 0 means that they didn't change their opinion at all. They didn't move their opinion in any way. And 0.5 means that they gave approximately equal weight to the advice and to their initial guess. We also had a little bit of concern that there would be some heterogeneity based upon the legal background, right? Maybe lawyers don't think about this the same way as people who have a background as paralegals. Right. So we want to be able to test this and make sure that, we're not receiving results that are somehow, highly variable based upon the legal background that they have. So the way that we do this is we do something called parallel regression. This is a method that Banzak developed in 2021. And was published, I believe, in the Journal of the American Statistical Association. And basically what he argues is that the traditional way of looking for heterogeneous treatment effects in experiments where you interact the characteristic with the treatment, that this is problematic because it doesn't have a causal interpretation. And so he goes through a number of proofs and suggests that something like this, which is which we call parallel regression, does have this characteristic of that it can, at least under certain assumptions, be considered a causal estimate of heterogeneous treatment effects. And the estimate that results is the ATME, or average treatment moderated effects. Now, the way that this is done is you run a regression with where the treatment condition is 0, and you have the covariates of interest, or that you think may result in heterogeneity. Then you run it again where the treatment is 1, and here again the B1SJ is the treatment where you think that there are the attributes where you think that there's heterogeneity, and then you have the other controls to help aid in closing potential backdoors for causality. You can then estimate the ATME by simply subtracting the beta under the treatment condition minus the beta under the control condition, and you can get the variance of these estimates by adding the variance of those two beta estimates together. And then, of course, taking the square root to get the standard error. We also asked several open-ended questions. So, treatment effects and survey questions are nice in terms of figuring out what the causal effect is, but they're not as great about telling us why that effect takes place. So in all of these experiments, we asked some open-ended follow-up questions about why they made their decisions, and then we analyzed this first off using structural topic models, or what I'll refer to here on out as STM. STM works similar to a number of other topic models, with the key thing being that it allows for us to include the covariates of interest, in this case, in particular, the treatment condition, in the topic model itself, in order to both estimate the topics of interest as well as the effect that these treatment conditions have on whether or not people emphasize particular topics over other topics. And then we also used some natural language processing to look at sentiment. We used 3 different sentiment estimates. We used the Stanza NLP Sentiment Analyzer, which uses convolutional neural networks to classify the sentiment of sentences. We also used the Valence-Aware Dictionary and Sentiment Reasoner, or VADR. They really tried hard to make that VADR work there. You rarely see where they use the second letter of a word to try to make it work. But anyway, this evaluates words within an n-gram context in order to determine the valence and sentiment of sentences. And lastly, we utilize TextBlob, which uses oh my gosh, there's a typo there. Well, anyway, it uses the sentiment of the words in a sentence to develop a sentence score. And the scores from these 3 methods were combined into an ensemble to produce an overarching sentiment score. So what are our results? Well, first off, what we generally find is that people in the legal community are relatively trusting of algorithms relative to other sources of advice. So here, the baseline condition is the wisdom of the crowd. And what we see is that, the baseline condition is the judge's advice. And what we see is, in terms of distance to advice, the differences are not significant, but people tend to, in their second forecast, give predictions that are closer to the computer algorithm's advice than to the judges, and significantly more than they do to surveys of people like themselves. Now, with this said, of course, as figure A shows up here, they still put a lot of weight on their own judgment. And in fact, what we generally find here is that people in the legal community put more weight on their own judgment, not a terrible lot more, but more weight than people in the general public did in our 2022 study. However, when we look at weight of advice, where we take into account what their initial forecasts were, what we find is that people in the legal community gave more weight to the computer algorithm about 5% more weight to the computer algorithm than they did to the judge. And this was a significant difference. And they gave much more weight to both the judge and the computer algorithm than they did to the survey. So how does this compare against what we found when we were looking at the general public? Well, here the one main difference is that people in the legal profession seem to give more weight relative to the other advice conditions to the judge than the general public did. But still, they seem to give more weight to advice from this minimally described computer algorithm than they did to an experienced judge. Our tests for the moderation effects, and you're going to get used to hearing me say this quite a lot, don't really turn up any significant differences between, so paralegals are the baseline condition, law enforcement and lawyers. There's really no significant differences or substantive patterns that we can identify that would suggest that people's behavior differs based upon their legal background. The opening question we asked was, can you please elaborate on why you did or did not trust the survey, judges, or algorithms advice? And so what we found was that there were two main topics here. The first topic, crime is the word mentioned most frequently, followed by judge. So when we're looking at the various treatment groups, what we find is that this is the topic most commonly associated with the judge treatment here. The other terms which we see here are things like think and believe, which speak to respondents' tendency to weigh their own beliefs higher than any other source. For example, one of the people who received the judge condition said, I have practiced law for almost 40 years. We have a current district judge who was in diapers when I passed the bar. I have more experience and I believe better judgment than many of them, right? Although I should say they did misspell then, but we won't hold that against them. The second topic is the one which is most cited by people who receive the algorithm treatment. So here you see algorithm up there. You also see experience and people here. And what you see here is a number of people saying that they don't necessarily trust the algorithm. One example of this is that I don't know all of how the algorithm was built, so I am making a prediction based on my own knowledge of people. Some people also thought that algorithms couldn't predict the irrationality of human behavior. An example quote, algorithms aren't super reliable for human behaviors, I think. However, what we do see is consistent, though, with the results that we found in the experiment. When we look at the sentiment expressed here, we do find people have expressed significantly more positive feelings when they were given the algorithm treatment than when they were given the judge or the previous survey treatment. So this gives us a little bit further backing for these treatment effects. Study 2. So for study 2, we decided to wade into probably the second most controversial use of algorithms in the criminal justice system, which is the use of facial recognition. So our treatment here gave them this vignette that investigators have gone to a court requesting a warrant to search the home where a suspect in a robbery investigation lives. Put yourself in the place of a judge and answer how likely you would be to issue this warrant. And there are 3 treatment conditions. One is an anonymous informant who basically called into a tip line after seeing the crime on television. The second one is an eyewitness to the crime who looked through a book of mugshots afterwards to identify the suspect. And the last is a facial recognition program evaluating surveillance footage of the crime. And in all these cases, they are all 75% sure. They think it's more probable than not that they recognize the suspect. And so investigators want to have a warrant issued based on this. The reason why we chose these conditions is because the anonymous informant, and especially an eyewitness, these are commonly used justifications for search warrants. So we're really looking to see how well facial recognition stacks up in their opinion versus these other sources. This is going to be the most boring slide ever. We used, or since there's only one instance of the experiment, we used OLS to estimate the average treatment effects. We again used parallel regression, this time without random effects to estimate the ATME. We used STM to analyze the topic relationships with the treatments, and we used the NLP sentiment analyzer to analyze sentiment in our open-ended responses. So what are the results here? Well, here we are using as the baseline the anonymous informant. And what we find here is that the facial recognition, while not quite significantly, this is one of those, some of you may have seen the old XKCD comic where, you know, if you get a p-value of 0.051, you're like, oh no, we got to estimate it again. Well, that's pretty much what happens here. It's very close to standard levels of statistical significance, but on average, it is higher. Probably more shocking, at least to me, is that there is no statistically significant difference. Indeed, the estimates are almost exactly the same between the facial recognition program and an eyewitness, right? So in terms of the sources of advice, I mean, again, here, usually if an eyewitness identifies a suspect, and there are problems with eyewitnesses, I know that. There are problems, especially when you give them a book of mugshots to analyze this problem. But with that said, 9 times out of 10, probably 19 times out of 20, maybe 99 times out of 100, a judge will issue a search warrant based on that identification. Right. And so the fact that people in the legal community are rating facial recognition right up there with it is pretty interesting. Here again, we looked for moderation effects and didn't find any significant moderation effects, especially not ones that we were really confident in. Law enforcement officers seem to be a little bit less likely to believe eyewitness accounts. On the converse side, lawyers seem to be a little bit more likely to believe facial recognition, but these didn't reach traditional levels of statistical significance. So for our open-ended question, we asked, what do you think why do you think the source's information was sufficient or insufficient to issue the warrant? And here, the STM model came up with 3 topics. Topic 1 and topic 2 express doubts about the ability of the system to correctly identify the suspect, whereas topic 3 seems to suggest greater confidence. The STM model suggests that this does depend a little bit on their treatment group. Individuals in the facial recognition group are less likely to have topic 1 words in this open-ended response. Which would indicate that they needed more information to be sure whether a warrant should be issued. In contrast, individuals in the facial recognition group are more likely to use topic 3 words. Now, this raises a question, right, which is that if people in the facial recognition condition are more likely than in the other conditions to cite words that suggest confidence in the system, then why is it that we don't find that that's the highest one? So Amanda came up with the bright idea of looking at the interaction here with whether or not they issued a warrant. And what we find here is that those who had a high level of citations of topic 2 versus topic 1, which was the case in the eyewitness in the eyewitness account, tended to be more likely to put greater weight or to issue the warrant than others. Here again, we did the ensemble sentiment analysis, and in this case, the ensemble sentiment analysis didn't really show any significant differences in terms of sentiment between the different treatment conditions. So now we go to study 3. And this one is one that my colleague who does judicial politics on a regular basis, Lydia Titi, was particularly interested in. Because one of the earliest types of algorithms that we've had in judicial decision making are sentencing guidelines, right? Sentencing guidelines were supposed to systematize the system of giving sentences to people based upon particular observables, like how heinous the crime was, how many previous offenses, things like that. And so what we did was we gave them a situation where the defendant entered a guilty plea to conspiracy to transport a controlled substance, in this case, cocaine. By the way, I should have mentioned at the beginning, all of these are designed with the advice of like legal professionals to try to get the wording, you know, at least there are some things that have to be stylized for experimental use, but at least to try to get the wording and the situations as close as possible to what it is they would likely be dealing with in the real world. So they are given the state sentencing guidelines, which gives a range between 5 and 15 years, although the judge has discretion to go above or below this range. So they are given a situation where either the prosecutors in the case, a judge with more than 10 years of experience who evaluated the case, or an algorithm developed by judges in computer sciences evaluated the case, or a probation officer evaluated the case. And they, in either case, they suggested that the defendant was low risk for recidivating and recommended a 2-year sentence. So we asked them, how long of a sentence would you give this person? And here again, it was a one-off situation. So we're using OLS regression to estimate the average treatment effects. We're using parallel regression to estimate the ATME. And then we've got 2 open-ended questions for which we'll use STM and our NLP ensemble. So in terms of the length of the sentence, here the probation officer is the one who is the baseline. And the estimates are the differences between what the source recommends and what the respondent gives as the final sentence. And so what we see here is that the closest is actually the probation officer, which kind of caught me by surprise at first, except that most of the people who have been in law enforcement for a while know that probation officers are actually the standard people who do this kind of evaluation of risk and have the most experience doing these kind of risk reports. The second one was the prosecutors, which had no statistically significant difference with the probation officer. And here again, with both the probation officer and with the judge, you kind of have this, for those of you who are familiar with the formal theory models about the value of biased information, the kind of idea here is that, you know, the prosecutors, generally speaking, as well as the probation officers, generally speaking, don't have incentives to give reduced sentences. Right? If anything, prosecutors tend to recommend higher sentences so that they can, you know, show that they are tough on crime for when they run for their next position, for when they want to be district attorney. And I realize this may be a little bit weird, just a little bit of context here. I'm not sure if this happens in Taiwan, but in the United States, we elect not only prosecutors, but we oftentimes elect judges. Carl can tell you all about the weirdness that happens with that in the state of Texas. So then we have the judge, and here the judge, people are significantly further away from the judge's advice. And similar with the algorithm, while there's no significant difference between the judge and the algorithm, there is a significant difference between the algorithm and the prosecutors, or the algorithm and the probation officer. So what's interesting is the first 2 studies seem to suggest that legal professionals are relatively trusting of algorithms relative to other sources. This study, however, seems to suggest that this is not the case, at least when it comes to this kind of sentencing. As I mentioned, there are 2 likely reasons for this. One is this value of biased information. And then the second one is that you know, in these kinds of situations where you're looking at the actual repercussions for an individual, people may be more hesitant to leave that up to an algorithm. There's actually a paper that I'm reviewing right now. I can't disclose too much about it because I'm a reviewer for it, but that seems to suggest that this is the case. And again, we don't find anything in terms of moderation effects. For the open-end questions, we asked them, please explain how you arrived at the sentence that you did. Here, there are two topics that were identified for this. The first topic here, so topic one mostly relies, is where respondents rely on the facts of the case. So in this case, they're looking at defendants' willingness to take responsibility for their actions, their low risk of recidivism, they talk about relying on sentencing recommendations, especially those made by the probation officer or the judge. That's topic two. Respondents rarely actually mention the algorithm in these responses, which was a little bit strange to us. And what we find is that these did not differ significantly between treatment group. So there wasn't that much difference in terms of how people talked about their decisions depending upon the treatment group. The last thing we asked them was, we said, algorithms are increasingly being used to advise on sentencing and bail decisions. Please let us know what you think about this trend. And here, what we find is, again, we've got two topics here. Topic one primarily expresses the concerns about algorithms, that they're not as good as people, weighing factors related to sentencing. Topic two talks about algorithms as a helpful tool to aid in human decision-making. We didn't find any real heterogeneity in the topics expressed by the background of the respondent. And similarly, we didn't really find any significant differences in the sentiment expressed in response to this question by the person's legal background. So what can we conclude from all this? Basically, there are three main takeaways. First off, we find very little to no evidence of overarching algorithm aversion in the legal community. Maybe we find a little bit of this when it's trying to decide the actual length of sentences. But even here, it's essentially equivalent to the judge's advice in terms of the treatment effect. And the differences between that and the prosecutor or the probation officer can also be explained through this value of biased advice kind of idea. Second thing, we find throughout this that people in the legal community give high weights to their own judgment. Similar to what we found in the general public, people seem to be really confident in their abilities to judge cases in criminal defense. And I should say this was actually a feature and not a bug when we first started doing these, because we actually wanted to be able to compare situations where people had relatively low information and low confidence. So in that case, predicting geopolitical outcomes versus situations where they have more confidence. And we figured that people are pretty judgmental, generally speaking, and so they might be more likely, and that bore out. People are very confident on their own opinions. But this is also why talking about algorithm aversion, when you're comparing that against people's own opinions and their trust in their own opinions, can be terribly misleading. And lastly, that the degree of trust relative to other sources is context dependent. So while we do see high levels of trust relative to other sources when it comes to evaluating the risk of a defendant, when it comes to identifying a potential defendant in order to issue a warrant, we don't see that same kind of trust when it comes relative to other common sources when it comes to the actual length of sentences. And so whether that is due to concerns about the ethics of it, whether that's due to concerns about, whether that's due to the value of biased advice. And either way, this suggests that the trust is going to be context dependent. And that's it. Thank you all for listening to me. I know it's not the most exciting thing to listen to somebody on, on Teams for an hour, so I really appreciate you all sticking around and bearing with me. I look forward to your questions.
Okay. All right, you want to start?
Oh, great, exciting. I think it's exciting. A lot of things, and it prompts me to think. Now, at this point, before I ask many questions, may I check if anyone in the audience would like to get the prize of the first question, poking the first question. I think I have a hand up here before I do that. And let me invite Glenn. Glenn, do you have a hand up?
Yes, I do.
Please,
yes,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I keep hitting the raise hand, and then it seems to come up and then it goes away, and so sorry about that. Keep raising my hand over and over. This is a totally fascinating topic, I gotta say.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I just love this. And I'm wondering if you've given thought to kind of the human decision-making dynamic versus the algorithm dynamic. In other words, things like bounded rationality and prospect theory and the Dunning-Kruger type effect, and looking at that versus the algorithm. That's question one. And question two is, have you given consideration to looking at what the algorithm produces, what the person produces, and some type of, quote, best result analysis? So two questions. One is, human decision-making theories versus algorithm. And the second is getting to algorithm, human versus best.
Absolutely. Two very good questions. So the first thing is that we have given some thought to the decision-making dynamics. In particular, so it's less the case here, but certainly in the previous study where we were using general public here, we seem to find that Dunning-Kruger is quite strong. However, what's interesting here is that there are two parts to Dunning-Kruger, right? So the first part to Dunning-Kruger is that people tend to express more confidence, oftentimes the less that they know, right? The second part of Dunning-Kruger is that people who do have expertise oftentimes view things as much more simple than they really are for others to understand, and also tend to be more cautious in terms of weighting their own advice, right? So we certainly saw Dunning-Kruger at work with the population samples. It's interesting, though, that here where we actually have people with expertise, their trust in their own judgment is on average higher than what we found among the general public. So, Dunning-Kruger certainly operates, well, although even here there's a little bit of a question, right? And again, this is something which my wife emphasizes, which is that people seem to be very confident in their own decisions based on at least what she, as a professional who has done this for well over 20 years, looks at and says is not even close to the amount of information that you would need in order to make this kind of decision, relative to, at least in theory, a judge or an algorithm which has access to much more information. So yeah, potentially, actually, I think I may have just talked myself into thinking that Dunning-Kruger is still at work here. But yeah, we have given some thought to that.
May I interject?
Yes, absolutely. Jump in here.
You are talking to lawyers.
That's a good point. Yes, yes. I do remember I had a friend, I have a friend who's a lawyer who used to joke that people always want me to be an expert on everything because I'm a lawyer. And I really wanted to respond to him and say, well, that's because you act like you're an expert on everything.
As the kids would say, true that.
Yeah. So your next question is actually something that I had to address as part of this hybrid forecasting competition, right? How do we come to an optimum kind of solution when we have human forecasters and, oh yes, I did forget about economists. Good point. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, so how do you come to like an optimum solution where you have human and machine estimates? And I mean, I'm not sure I have a 100% good answer to this. When we did the hybrid forecasting competition, what we ended up finding very strangely was that between phase 1 and phase 2, the relative weight given, so we were able to submit multiple like algorithmic combinations of the human forecast and the machine forecast. And basically it flipped between the phases. In phase 1, the human forecasters were more accurate and our algorithms that upweighted the human end of it performed better. Similar, by the way, to what Phil Tetlock was suggesting in his book, Super Forecasters. But then in phase 2, it actually flipped completely. And the ones where we gave more weight to the machine forecasts ended up performing better. The reality is that it really depends on context and on goals, right? So this isn't published work, but I think it's an illustration of this. So the compass algorithm, so Dressel and Farid find that random people from Mechanical Turk give, on average, they have the same accuracy as the compass algorithm in terms of predicting recidivism. However, while the accuracy is the same, they actually make different kinds of mistakes. And so, just for the heck of it, I decided to do a simulation of like the decision, like basically the decision, trying to think of what, when basically how much utility you would have to associate with false positives versus false negatives. And based on that, what choice would you end up making on whether to use compass or whether to use the MTurk forecast? And the results suggested that if your goal is to have fewer people who shouldn't be in jail put in jail, you should always select the compass algorithm. Or sorry, if you want fewer people to be wrongly put in jail, you should always go with the compass algorithm. If you want to avoid false negatives, right? So where you release people who go on to commit a crime, then you go with the Turkers. And so, this is a long way of saying a few different things. One, it's really context dependent. If I were to tell you, based on my look at phase 1 versus phase 2, the big difference is that I think in phase 2, they were using questions that the algorithms were much more suited to answer. And so there, you were better off relying on the algorithm and using the humans kind of as a secondary check, versus in phase 1, they tended to be things where we were, kind of making algorithms on the fly based on this data, right? You're using very generic time series. And so I think that's, one, it depends on context, how you balance these two. Secondly, it depends on your policy goals, right? And in fact, this is something I've got another paper that I'm working on with somebody from the law school. I try not to hold that against him. And, really what we look at there is how people evaluate trade-offs between the utility of using algorithms which are likely to reduce the number of people put in prison versus issues about like the bias in those algorithms. And actually, Amanda's working on that one too. So might as well.
Yeah,
Sorry, did that get at your question, or did I
yes,
just completely dodge it?
both of them very well, and I appreciate that. It's an interesting thought because when I said, the best result, the algorithm versus the human versus the best, and you can't see me, but I'm putting quotes around the best. And what I think what you're saying is that those quotes are important because it could be, the best depending upon whether your legal attitude is conservative or your legal attitude is liberal, where it falls in that kind of continuum of
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And what we're finding in the other study is that it can also be, people seem to be more sensitive to bias when it's with algorithms, and they tend to be with bias when it comes to judges or law enforcement, which is another kind of interesting phenomenon.
It would be interesting at some point in the future to be able to put a scale on that, where you could say to the algorithm, I want to be this way, or I want to be that way in my decision. When the algorithm makes a decision for you, I want it to be more conservative, I want it to be more liberal. That would be a very, very interesting topic. And the book that you mentioned, Super Forecasting, The Art and Science of Prediction, is that the one you mentioned?
That's the one. That's the one that inspired the hybrid forecasting competition. So
okay.
Yeah,
that's something to add to the reading list, it sounds like.
It doesn't deal as much. Well, it's a very interesting book on. I mean, it's Phil Tetlock, right? I mean, he's done some most interesting work on people's ability to forecast future geopolitical events. And I just like it generally as a decision-making book. Because the tips that he gives for what makes someone a super forecaster are really interesting.
Okay. I get
The other thing I'd say is
I get 30 points on Amazon if I buy it now from Kindle.
Go. Yeah, you can see what you think about it. Also, though, your idea of allowing people to kind of set the scale based on their desired outcomes, there is some research. One of the studies by Dietverst et al. Actually shows that when people are able to modify an algorithm even a little bit, they tend to be more trusting in the algorithm's outcomes. And we actually did that with our system design in the hybrid forecasting competition, where we let people kind of adjust parameters a little bit so they could see different, how those parameters affected the forecast. Partially as a way to see whether or not they would use it. Unfortunately, our power for that experiment wasn't great, and which is the reason why it didn't really end up being used. But
very good. All right, I appreciate the conversation. That was great. Very interesting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe I can pass on to Taiwan side to collect any questions. So do we have any questions from the students audience in the Taiwan side?
Okay, and there's a question or comment. Well, you decided. It's about trust, the issue of trust. So the studies compare the trust in decision made by algorithm and human, right? And sort of the direction, and an extension of the issue of trust, that there are various sources of trust. That's what we know. So different people might have different weights on the sources without knowing it. Well, for example, there are several common decision-making biases by human, though, such as the lacunae effects, and underestimate something and overestimate something because of computer or the algorithm are more accurate, or accuracy and consistency. And maybe there are some lunar effects that underestimate the importance of like open communication or transparency. Now, this is what we know about the biases where the biases come from. So might not be a question though, but it's an idea or insights get from your study, that if we look into the sources of the trust, and then we might come up with some different different map of how people trust in algorithm or human decisions. So that's another way of thinking about this. I'm not sure. What do you think about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't expect the sources of trust to be the same between algorithms and interpersonal trust, right? Interpersonal trust is usually based on both an idea of capacity. So do you think the person who is your agent has the ability to do what you want to do? And an idea of beneficence. Do they have your best interests at heart in the advice or what they're telling you? Now, talking about beneficence of an algorithm, rightfully seems a little bit strange, and there is some backing for this. So another colleague of mine, Zachary Zwald, and I did a study about people's willingness to utilize autonomous weapon systems. And what we found was that while people tended to, equally trust the capacity of the system, even I should say some systems that to our minds were pretty sketch, they did not assume the same level of beneficence to it. So, when you ask them about, do you think that this this autonomous weapon will act in accordance with your goals? Do you think that it will avoid collateral damage, things like that? We found that people rated it significantly lower in that regard. So people do make distinctions about the way or the reasons why they trust algorithms. I should also say that and I really want to do, this is a total time factor. I basically spent last summer reading through well, I guess though, in the summer before that, reading through the Oxford Handbook of Ethics of Artificial Intelligence. And there were a whole bunch of things in there that I was like, we really should test that. One of them is that several of the chapters in there argue that people trust algorithms because of a false sense of precision, right? Whereas a person says, yeah, I think that person is pretty likely to commit another crime. An algorithm says there is a 90% chance that they will commit another crime or something like that. And so, it would be interesting to see the extent to which that false precision mechanism plays into whether or not people trust the algorithm. Even here, where we're giving them equally precise estimates, people probably look at a judge saying, yeah, I'm 75% sure, and think, I'm not really sure what that means when a person tells me they're 75% sure. So that could absolutely be part of the reason why you see this trust in algorithms.
Okay, thank you. We have an. Yep, go ahead.
By the way, you don't have to read that whole book.
What chapter?
This is the book.
Wow.
It's about as thick as my head. I don't
So that's why you spend the whole
anyone
summer.
want to do that.
So are there particular chapters?
There are a few chapters that I think are better than others. I tell you what, when I do so I'm going to post a lot of this information on GitHub. I can also post my syllabus for my Politics and Ethics of Artificial Intelligence class. And that has a few selected chapters out of this.
I need to look up your class and your syllabus in it. Now, can I ask maybe one of my first questions? I have a series, and I look up a compass system. This is something I'm not particularly familiar with, and I heard lots of report about the problems, criticism of this system, and so I first of all, I want to ask a question about your information theory. So I do not know if I missed that. So do you distinguish number one, and the information intensity or information requirements of different cases. For example, will some misdemeanor cases will be generally easier or less information intensive versus the homicide, felony cases, and how these scale interact with the knowledgeability of your samples and different groups. And of course, we could assume judge should be more capable in dealing with this highly information intensive cases versus others. So how much that could be? I think you may have addressed that. Maybe I missed that when you look at the interaction of this, and that could be something we can learn and how that will contribute to the information theory when you apply to algorithm-based decision making. So because that will give more light as to how the algorithm in future could be improved, and to at least to look at different kind of information intensive cases to see how at what area and the algorithm should be improved.
Yeah, no, this is a really good question. So when we did study one, and I'm afraid I'm going to have a very, well, shoot, let me, you know what, let me go all the way back
I
here.
think you have one on the ATE.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
So, yeah, so the estimate of the ATE here.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, so the idea here would be that we would look at the essentially do like a random slope model within the profile that's in there. And yeah, I think you're right. I think that, you know, testing how this differs between the treatment effects differ between profiles is really good.
Yes.
Unfortunately, like I said, my answer is going to be horribly unsatisfying at this point, which is that we're saving that for the book. So this paper is already, this paper is already really information dense and long. So that's one of a few analyses that we're saving to do. We're going to be starting with a book version about this over Christmas break. And so, yeah, that's one of the analyses. I'll let you know how it goes.
Okay, yeah. Then I have another question. Now, from the language model point of view, so how much this algorithm could be better learner, and when it comes to additional mistakes being taken into account, or when it comes to comparing maybe judges, maybe some better decision makings, and how much that could be factored into this algorithm improvement. And I know there could be something related to the compass instead of this talk, but your talk actually is giving a lot of insights into how much then that could be lending way to future of more AI assisted human decision making. I'm saying this because I think that we are still not giving up, say, everything to the algorithm, everything to the AI. I think you have the lab talking about human assisted, human, and could be a hybrid. So how much that could be pointing to some improvement of the algorithm?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of things here. One of them is, and let me know if I'm going off on a tangent here. One of them is that, so we've done some other studies of this, and generally speaking, what we've found is that when people are given a scenario in which there is a hybrid decision-making format, so in other words, a judge, for example, is deciding in light of the recommendations of the algorithm, and they either like go with the algorithm's decision or go against the algorithm's decision. What we generally find is that people in that situation, it's really interesting. People tend to give more weight to the hybrid decision than they do to either the human or the algorithm alone.
Yeah.
But what's super interesting about that is that at least in the situations where we've looked at it, no, I should take that back. There is one exception to this, but in the situations where we've looked at generally, the weight given to the human advice or when there's disagreement increases. So what we found, for example, in our 2022 study was that the relative weight given to the judge, which remember, we found that people by themselves give the judge less weight than the algorithm. But when the judge disagrees with the algorithm, they actually give the judge twice the amount of weight that they give the algorithm. And so the idea here is that people view, have this idea that when there's a human in the loop, so to speak, that then the human's decision, the human is able to take into account some kind of information that the algorithm doesn't have and is therefore able to make a more competent decision. And I just remembered what the exception to this is. The exception to this, which might be a little horrifying, is I believe I'm remembering this right. The exception to this is target identification for bombing, which is a little scary.
This is This is particularly interesting. I think I need to open up another topic when it comes. Maybe next time we come to talk about ethics or AI. So trust and information. So that could be a point that they are not. So these two concepts are not necessarily orthogonal. So in a way that, and when information comes to more to a point, to an uncertainty point, and then we will open up to the trust coming in, right? Trust to come in versus the information guided, information intensive kind of decision, right? This is what your takeaway.
Yeah. So it's really. So, and this is there's another dimension to this as well, which is that, and this is something actually that the Army has recently asked me to look into, is that in theory, you don't want people to have too much trust in automated systems, right? There's supposed to be some kind of sweet spot where they trust it enough that they're able to, use the information, but they distrust it enough to where they can recognize the errors. And so this is something starting in January, we're going to be looking into this pretty intensively. I also wonder if maybe this idea of optimal levels of trust is a little bit, I don't want to say wrong-headed, but that's the only word that comes to mind right now. In that, potentially instead of it being that there's an optimal amount of trust, that there are things that are orthogonal to trust. Right, like maybe your ability to think critically about the information that you're getting. I'm not sure why we would assume that would necessarily be the same thing as trust on some kind of optimization problem. And so, yeah, we're going to start looking into that in January. We'll see what happens.
I think maybe the word you were looking for was philosophical.
Maybe, yeah, maybe that's right. It's just this like curiosity that I've had that we have. I've seen probably about 20 plus studies that mention this idea, and I'm guilty of it too, of mentioning optimal trust, right? And yet every time we try to study optimal trust, it ends up being really messy if it's studied at all, right? Optimality of trust is kind of difficult. That's part of the reason why I was kind of excited to work with the Army on this, is because in theory, at least, I could have an outcome that I would know, right? Optimal trust is whatever level of trust puts the most ammunition on target, right? But the more I've been thinking about this, the more I'm wondering if we don't need to, expand out and think about, other factors that don't necessarily have to do with trust, right? I mean, I can trust the system that I still, look into critically, right? How many of you trust your GPS, but still, when you're getting ready to drive, the first thing that you do is you zoom in on the little areas to make sure that you know which streets there are, and how things are working with that. That suggests that the inclusion of that map allows for a certain level of critical thinking and information digging. And so, to me, that doesn't necessarily trade off with trust. And so maybe, this idea of optimal trust is not really the right way to think about it. Maybe we need to think about trust as one dimension in a multi-dimensional kind of framework of understanding how artificial intelligence works best. I should say, by the way, this optimal trust thing, even where I would think they would totally be able to test this, in the cases of autopilot and stuff like that, a lot of times they don't really seem to, give what the optimum is. They just kind of say there is an optimum out there, somewhere between, pressing the button to use the autopilot and letting the autopilot crash you is, the ideal level of trust. So yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
and
I have to say this. The trust part with the navigation systems, if you've ever driven with my father-in-law, you will know there is no trust at certain points. The other question, I did have one other question. Generally, are you surprised that the artificial intelligence, natural language processing, and how it impacts economics and sociology? It's kind of my thing, and so I'm very interested in it. But are you surprised at how fast artificial intelligence has become integrated into, everyday life?
Yeah. And this is, the short answer is yes. And the funny story about this is that when I first started looking into these issues of trust in AI and public policy, I kept on getting the comment of, why are you looking into this? No, nothing in public policy involves artificial intelligence, to where now I'm getting responses from reviewers about, oh, this is a very topical issue. I mean, it's really surprising. And just as surprising to me is how quickly it's been adopted without people knowing that it's been adopted, right? So as part of this NSF grant, we were talking with people in local government about their uses of artificial intelligence in various capacities. And so many of them, when we talk to them, their first response would be, we don't use artificial intelligence. We don't use any of that stuff. And then I would ask to go through their workflow, and I would be looking at it, I'd be saying, well, no, that's right there. That's a system, that's a predictive system based on past data. At least technically, this is an artificial intelligence system. It may not be neural networks, but it's an artificial intelligence system. And they were surprised, right? They think of artificial intelligence, to use the old engineering quote, artificial intelligence is whatever is new and cool right now, right? And anything that's before that is not artificial intelligence. And so, you know, yeah, it's very interesting both how it's surprising how quickly it's come about and how quickly it's come about without people realizing that it's come about.
Yes, so I really thought we had another 10 years.
I did too. I did too. Especially on some of these problems. Like, I mean, I thought, something like ChatGPT was maybe not 10 years, but at least like another like 5 years out for it to work as well as it does. With, of course, the caveat that there are some things it does not work well on. If any of you are considering getting ChatGPT to find citations, I'm not going to name the colleague, but I had a colleague who recently did that and expressed shock when ChatGPT made up citations that were from, they gave real authors, real journals, and titles that sounded credible, but they didn't exist. So don't do that.
I saw that a lot too. I saw it a lot. Now, now we have, you brought a really good, really interesting question about which I said, look up this could be becoming, I think you may have cited this when we talk about this, that this could be interesting read for the reader. Now, we do not have much time left, and I want to see, particularly in the Taiwan audience, do you have any questions, as students or audience or faculty there? And for Ryan, before we move on to maybe another topic. Can I hear you? Yeah. Can you unmute?
Yes.
Good.
All right. Some of our students are interested in the sort of governance issue. So, for example, AI-human hybrid decision making. In today, we're talking about legal systems that human might get, for example, like twice weight as much as AI. When it comes to some hybrid decision making. So it could be quite different in other contexts, though. So as a methodologist, so what would you suggest how this might be addressed? Is it possible to design a research that aims to find, well, at least some rule of thumbs regarding how this hybrid could be? It's different contexts, and then we have different weight. So the example that you just gave, that human get twice as much as AI, and so how do we address this kind of issue scientifically? Use some evidence or to come up with to come to this conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a very good question. How do we set up the kind of regulatory framework around these in order to on the one hand make sure that we're not having decisions driven by bad algorithms, and on the other hand, we're still getting the benefits of the algorithms. Because let's be honest, judges are not necessarily great decision makers, right? There are plenty of studies that suggest that judges, viewing the same case facts will give very different sentences and, variations on that. I think a lot of it really comes down to making sure that the people who are using these algorithms are able to understand what it is they can or cannot do, and to continuously have reevaluation and reworking. Right. One of the biggest problems that can occur with an algorithm is that you develop it, you release it into the wild, and then you just kind of tell it to run free, right? And in too many cases, including in some of the cases that we've looked into here in Harris County, that's basically what ended up happening. And because of that, people who are using it didn't know when it was appropriate versus when it was inappropriate to use, what the context for it was. And including lawmakers didn't necessarily know this. We talked a little bit about the COMPAS algorithm. COMPAS was designed for bail decisions. But in the state of Wisconsin, it was being used for sentencing decisions, something that it was never designed for. And in fact, the company even said, this is not an algorithm to be utilized for sentencing decisions, right? So a lot of it has to do with, making sure that there's education, that there's knowledge about it, that we have people in government who understand this. I was recently at a conference about data science and local governments here in Texas, and one of the things that was mentioned several times was that major cities probably at some point are going to have a chief artificial intelligence officer, whose job it is to actually evaluate and monitor these things and be in charge of making sure that they're not just releasing these into the wild with no supervision over them. So yeah.
All right, great. I think this is a really interesting topic. I think it will take 2 lectures from you. So, but we really like to take the best out of you, and maybe before I ask another group of questions, can I invite Amanda? Do you want to add anything? And do you want to talk about maybe how you get inspired to this research? And yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting my voice in here. It's just been such a treat to work with Ryan and Lydia on this project. It's actually, this was kind of the beginning in my introduction to work. I've kind of used it to springboard and look at other projects now on how do you hold AI accountable when it makes mistakes. So that's one of the things that I'm really interested in next. So I'll be looking at that in regards to some game theoretical studies and the ultimatum. How do you punish? And can you really punish? Do people are they able to understand that if AI produces an unfair result, how do you hold them accountable? Is it the same way that you would hold a human? So that's one of the things that I'll be looking on from here. So honestly, this first piece that we did here really has been an inspiration into the entire literature. I've learned so much from working with Dr. Kennedy, and I'm excited to continue to do so.
Amanda, as you probably can tell, is also very nice.
Well, I'm sure the students that are here, listening to what you have to say, and the very careful way in which, we worked through this design and tested everything and analyzed all the results. Hopefully they can incorporate some of that into their work and find some inspiration to search into the topic further themselves.
Yeah, I want to say congratulations. You're such an excellent piece of work, and I look forward to seeing you seeing this getting in print or in press, and then I think it will be a contribution to the judicial literature and also AI literature, and this will be highly citable, and when we come to these multiple topics, not just one topic. Now, I think before I let Dr. Kennedy go, I think I promised the students and audience I would like you to talk more about your piece in science. I think it's been over 1,000, maybe 1,200, maybe 1,300 citations.
Yeah.
And this is in different disciplines too. So maybe I can ask most important question first. So do you get to follow up in this research, and what is your latest work and along this line? And I think lots of data science students would like to hear from the original author of this.
Yeah. So, for those of you who might be less familiar with this, yeah, it's really weird that I'm a political scientist, but my most cited work is probably, arguably either in data science or epidemiology, depending upon where you put it.
Or computer science.
Yeah. So, in terms of updates since that paper came out, one of the things that happened after that paper was published, perhaps not surprisingly, is that Microsoft really liked our results, right? Showing that
because it hates Google, of course.
That's right. It turns out one of Gary King's brothers works for Microsoft. And so he convinced them to allow us to do a follow-up study, which recently finally saw light of day. This thing had delays all over the place, but came out in Nature Communications. And basically what we do there is we suggest that some of the data scientists can learn from social scientists, right? So one of our critiques of the Google Flu setup was that they really didn't try and establish, any kind of causality. In fact, at this time, this is the time when that book, Big Data by Victor Meyer-Schoenberger and Kenneth Kukier was really popular. And they argued, we don't need theory anymore, right? We don't need causality. We don't need these kind of things because we've got so much data that correlation is just enough to produce these things. So what we tried doing was we utilized, Microsoft had access to the survey system, which linked up people's survey responses to their search history. All right. Now, did I get the wrong? Well, anyway, to their search history. Now, admittedly, it was Bing search history, so take that for what it's worth. But nonetheless, what we were able to do then was we were able to use a standard survey mechanism for determining whether or not somebody had had the flu. And then we looked at their search histories. And what we did was I used that to identify search terms that were specific to the actual incidence of flu. And not only that, we were able to look at the different demographic patterns of people who execute these searches. So these are searches we can be reasonably confident people were searching for them because they had, or one of their family members had the flu. We can also look at some of the demographics in this. And one of the funny findings from this is that, stereotypically, you would think that it's the mothers of children who have the flu who go to Google to search or go to a search to try and find out things. Nope, it's clueless dads who are the ones who are much more likely to turn to a search engine when their kids are sick. And so, we were able to incorporate all this information into an MRP model that produced, state-of-the-art estimates of flu, as well as producing flu estimates at a lower level of aggregation than is standard. And so the basic punchline here is that the tools that we use and the way we think about things as social scientists have a lot to tell data scientists as well, in particular when it comes to things like, causality matters, right? So.
Yeah. And this will be the video I would like to have my students to watch again and again because it's from the original author, and it's a great part. Now, so how much we can maybe you can talk a bit more about data science now, AI. How much these computer scientists or data scientists can learn from other disciplines. I do not want to say that, you need to learn from political science, even though I know we are smarter in some way. But how do you see the future? And really, do they really incorporate more social science or other disciplines into mapping and a better way of doing data science or AI? And I am seeing could be another possibility that ChatGPT, for example, rolling out a lot of replicated information, the literature and bibliography, and so how much that you think that they really will listen instead of just still focus on the bubble of, oh, we know everything and computer science can do everything. Yeah.
Well, I will say that, like, I mean, I work with a lot of computer scientists and engineers, and I think there is a growing agreement with, Justin Grimmer had an article in PS where he basically says we're all social scientists now, right?
Yeah.
Among my computer science colleagues and my engineering colleagues, I do find that they place a lot of value on social science expertise, right? Because increasingly, AI is dealing with humans. It's interacting with humans in real space. So it's not a simple matter of I remember 10 years ago, the biggest thing with computer science was, or one of the coolest things with computer science was creating an algorithm which could solve the double pendulum problem, which is super cool. But it doesn't involve humans, so you don't have to worry about the political or economic or social aspects of it. Increasingly, we're having to deal with these kinds of impacts, and so a lot of the people who I work with, interact with, really want social scientists more engaged in the computer science work, and a lot of social scientists really want computer scientists more engaged in the social scientific work. And so to the extent that we can create those kinds of linkages, I mean, I think all the better. Even if we even if, like, you mentioned my lab's name, the acronym for it is MAD, and the reason for that is because I saw a comic that said there's no such thing as a mad social scientist, and I wanted to prove that wrong. So even incorporating the mad social scientists into it, I think is beneficial.
All right, and I still have tons of questions, but now. Peter or in the audience on both sides, and want to pose any questions or when not necessarily related to my questions, or you can ask anything. And I particularly want to say that this before Dr. Kennedy comes to the colloquium, we talk about multiple research project of his, and I believe that this one is really timely and really relevant to data science students, political science students, because this is actually echoing his work in science, that published in Science, and that is showing how much we can bridge the two. And this piece is particularly relevant, of course, about the hybrid decision making. And I think I may not talk too much about. There's actually a lot of work in his bios, and I encourage you to go to his website. And also he's author of the book and Introduction to R for Social Scientists, a Thai D programming approach, and you may want to look into that. And you are also teaching an ICPSR course. And can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the ICPSR course is actually based on the book, or I should say the book was based on the ICPSR course. We had all the code and everything like that, and we're just like, why don't we make this into a book? So my guess is that most of the people in this room are plenty familiar with R. Actually, most of the people who end up taking this course are like mid or longtime academics who are more like Lawrence Data or SPSS, and now their co-authors are all telling them that they need to use R. But yeah, if anybody is interested in taking it, definitely, let me know. Let me know if you have any questions. There's also the associate website, which is I2RSS. It has the code from the book, and things like that to help out. So
Mhm.
feel free to ask me, any kind of questions that may come up with it or anything like that.
Okay.
I need to write a
Yep.
Julia book next, I think.
Then you do multiple languages too, right? And now we have Julia really up now. Rust is another one, and now we can take the whole night talk about your
There's
next
too
book.
much
Your
to
next
learn,
books.
which is
Your next books.
delightful, right?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. All right, and it's I think of a few minutes left, and let me double check if you have maybe one last questions or any comments and anything you want to particularly have Dr. Kennedy address or Amanda address.
So Carl, you have the privilege. You want to take advantage of the last 5 minutes? Carl?
All right. So I think you may want to actually maybe open up another possible lecture by Dr. Kennedy. You mentioned about your lab. Can you introduce a little bit more about your lab and what is the concept of that and what inspires you to come up with this lab?
Yeah, so the lab had a few different things, some trivial, some not so trivial. The trivial one was that, when I was applying for grants, pretty much everybody seemed to have a lab that was associated with it. And so I went to our
The Kennedy
administration
lab.
and said, yeah, I went to our administration and said, what would it take for me to set up a lab? And they said, well, you just have to call yourself a lab. And so I'm like, done. All right, we'll take that. But actually, there's a deeper purpose and one which it's really served well, which is to kind of create a broader community. The way things work a lot of times in academia is that you've got your particular research assistants who are like assigned to you, and that those are the people who you work with. And it doesn't really allow you to extend out to work with other people, to continue working with those who have graduated, things like that. And the lab has really helped to maintain that kind of continuity. So people like Philip Wagner, Adam Ozer, Miriam Sharon, all these people who have gone through the lab in various capacities and are still, reasonably active actually in lab projects. So it really helps to create this continuity. It also helps to create a broader community because I have a number of students who aren't I refer to them as my graduate students because, I work with them and, I love my grad students, right? But, a number of them, well, for example, Adam Ozer, Phil Wagner, I was not on their dissertation committee, right? But we had overlapping interests through the lab that we began working on. Actually, Amanda kind of falls into this as well. Her area is evolutionary politics, and so evolutionary psychology. So I'm hoping she'll be actually presenting at the Texas Methods Conference some of her work of doing biological modeling of scarcity and the effects on redistribution policies. So I think that's been the really rewarding part of the lab is that it's really given me the ability to build this kind of broader community of, not just the graduate students who are assigned to me, but also other graduate students who are interested in it, graduate students who are no longer graduate students who have graduated and now are in academia or in the private sector. On a very practical point, some of my students have gone into the private sector and their private companies don't want them to say that that's their affiliation. So I can always say that they're a part of the Mad Lab. Right? And problem solved. So yeah, there's a lot of really useful things to it. maybe eventually I'll, turn it into, something that's more of a funding hub or something like that, kind of like what you see in the natural sciences. But until that point, it's been really great help.
Yeah, I talked to my group of students, and I really like to use the model after your lab and follow your example doing things. So regarding test map, I cannot say for Patrick, but I personally really look forward to seeing you in person, and both of you. Hopefully, we can see you in Dallas. We can welcome you to here, and it will be exciting time, and maybe we can teach us in a workshop or two, and so this was something
one way or the other. One way or the other, I'll be there. I've got to bring my son and show him the flying pancake again. So,
which restaurant again? The flying pancake. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yes. And my son is obsessed with airplanes. So at the Flight Museum in Dallas, they've got the flying pancake.
Oh, yeah.
Which was responsible for like 8 UFO sightings or something like that.
And not Rockwell. And anyways, and I look forward to welcome you and your son and Amanda to Dallas, and very soon, and then in that is February.
Yep.
All right, I thank Peter, and may I turn to you to see, do you have any concluding remarks?
Well, I'm sort of envy you, and you can travel from Houston to Dallas, and you can see you in February. So, but I still have to, cordially invited. If there's any opportunity, please come visit Taiwan, and then so that we can, because Carl and I
love
have,
to.
yeah, we have a few initiatives and going on, and I certainly hope that we can include you in some way. So I think this is a very important project that Carl can work on. So
yeah, I put it down already. I mark it as my to-do list to bring Dr. Kennedy and his lab to Dallas, to Taiwan, not to Dallas. Dallas is easy. Taiwan. Okay. This is something we're working on.
All right. So I think the time is up, and I want to thank Amanda and Ryan, Dr. Kennedy, and for giving us very insightful talk, and especially that we have received a lot of information here, and my students here are all very thankful for this wonderful presentation. And again, this is our season finale, and I'm glad this Dr. Kennedy, you did well, and then give us
thank you.
That's right. It's a very, very good one. And so I want to thank everyone for supporting DAC, especially for the past 6 weeks. 6 talks. So do come back, and we're hoping there will be the 5th season coming. And if our manpower and money enough, so that we can have a longer season instead of just 6 talks, maybe just a year-long project. So looking forward to that, and we hope that this is a good platform that we can exchange and learn new things. So I do learn a lot from this colloquium. So I hope all the audience feel the same. All right, thank you. So Carl, you want to say something?
But you said all the big things now. I think I don't need to say anything. I want to say thank you again, and Ryan and Amanda, and so hopefully maybe in future we can do some in-person colloquium, right, Peter?
Yeah.
It doesn't take
Thank
much.
you all so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure.
I wanted to be able to
Thank
participate.
Okay. All right.
Have a good night. Have a good night.
Right.
Have a good lunch and in Taiwan.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, please. Yeah. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.